Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Make Learning More Efficient and Effective. Our host today, Betsy Hill, is a neuroeducator and president of Brainware Learning Company. She has studied the application of neuroscience to teaching and learning and works with educators, clinicians, and corporate trainers on using neuroscience research to address some of the most perplexing problems in education. During today's presentation, please type any questions you have in the chat box. Once Betsy has finished her prepared remarks, we will get to as many of your questions as possible. And with that, I will turn it over to Betsy.
Great, thank you, Kaylin. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. I am so happy to be here. I think this is my third webinar for the Homeschool Buyers Co-op, and I always really look forward to bringing new insights from neuroscience, including perplexing problems, which is, I think I need to change my bio. That's just too darn hard to say. Anyway, but I really enjoy sharing them with parents who are as committed as those of you who are participating in the webinar today. So as I thought about this, I really wanted to sort of combine efficiency and effectiveness in the same webinar, particularly because the need for efficiency in our learning processes is certainly greater than it's ever been before. When I was a little girl, I used to think that I could read all the books in the world. You know, I didn't really have a very good sense of how many there really were, but I was going through my books at home and in the local library at a terrific clip, and I thought maybe I could get there, but clearly it's not possible, especially today with millions of books being published every year, 2.5 million in 2017. I have no idea. It's probably several millions at least this year. But it does really raise the question of how you filter and master the knowledge and skills we really do need. So efficiency is important. And it's not just book learning, of course. It's the learning that we're exposed to from all of the information that we're constantly bombarded with. If you think about your computer, if it's pretty advanced, you might have 8 or even 16 gigabytes of memory, of RAM. And we're exposed to many, many times that, far, far more than the most advanced computers, 36 million gigabytes of information every day. I don't know how they figured it out, but include hearing or seeing 105,000 words, 23 per second, during waking hours, plus all of the other content that we're, so we got a lot going on, a lot to keep track of. So making learning efficient and effective is important. And it turns out that many of the learning practices we're familiar with, that we grew up with, are neither of those things. So today I'm going to share with you my top 10. And as we're doing that, I wanted first to remind ourselves a little bit about what learning is. So usually when I ask pretty much anybody to define learning, I will hear something like acquiring new knowledge and skills, or being able to do something you weren't able to do before, or something like that. And those are all correct, of course, but in education, we tend to focus on the acquisition and being able to show we've acquired something. But at its core, learning is truly a biological process. When we learn, it's the process of making and strengthening connections between thousands of neurons, forming neural networks or maps in our brains. And when we remember something, what we're actually doing is not going and pulling that information out of a vault somewhere. We're actually reactivating. We reconstruct the memory by reactivating those previously made connections. So when we remember something, the neurons in those neural networks that were involved in the original learning process are being activated again. And the more we do that, when we reactivate and we remember, we recall, and we use those neural networks again and connect to them, every time we do that, every time we activate them, those linkages get stronger and stronger. And that's why the neuroscientists say neurons that fire together wire together. So just as a little bit of a reminder, we're not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it's really helpful to sort of visualize what's going on when we're in this learning process. So when we talk about neurons, there are 85 billion of them in our brains, and then we have a bunch of other kinds of cells that support them. And this is a picture of 3 neurons, of course, each of which you can see the little nucleus in the cell body. That's that little black dot. You can see that each one has 1 axon. That's that long sort of stringy thing coming out. The axon is what transmits an electrical signal from one neuron to the next one. The dendrites are where the connections are made to take in information in each of the neurons. There are about 6,000 dendrites, so the whole surface of a neuron is basically covered with these ways of taking in information. So they're connected to thousands and thousands and thousands of other neurons to take in that information, but one way to compute, one signal that's coming out. When those 2 pieces come together, the axon and the dendrite, it's at a juncture called a synapse. And that synapse is where the signal from the one neuron transmits, basically goes from being an electrical signal to a chemical one. And that's where the neurotransmitters that you've heard of, dopamine and serotonin and other kinds of neurotransmitters are filling up those synapses to transmit the information. Of course, they're not anywhere near that big. They're very, very small. This is actually a picture of what neurons look like in a slide of brain tissue. Enlarged, of course, many times. 30,000 neurons would fit on the head of a pin. So hopefully you can see, if you look at the little black dots in this image, those are the cell bodies, and the profusion, all those connections, all those lines between them, those are all of the trillions and trillions of connections among those neurons. What we're actually looking at here is layers of the cortex. That's the outside part of our brain, all that wrinkly stuff, if you've seen a picture of a brain. So just imagine all of these neurons activating, transmitting signals, communicating to each other to activate or to calm other neurons. The brain is a very, very busy place. But it's also important to understand that our brain didn't start off with all those connections. So here are 2 more images of brain tissue from the cortex. The one on the left is a picture of from the brain of a newborn, and the one on the right is a 2-year-old. This is a picture of learning. At birth, the brain has just about as many neurons as we do as adults, 85 billion or so, and it weighs about 1 pound. From the time the first neurons are created in utero up to age 2, each neuron in the cortex creates about 1.8 synapses per second. By 1 year, the brain has doubled in size, and by 5 or 6, it is 90% of its adult size and weight. So remember that what's happening there, that incredible growth, is not the result of the creation of new neurons. We do create some new neurons, but really not very, very many. What it is that exponential growth of all of those connections among the neurons that accounts for that, the growth in the size of the brain as well as in the weight, and of course, all that learning that's going on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a page from David Letterman in The Late Show and do my top 10 list as a countdown. And so I promise, unfortunately, I probably won't be as funny as he is with his countdown, but hopefully everybody will find something in here that really resonates with them and that you can apply whenever you're working with your children as they're learning. So the first one, number 10 on the countdown list, is prior knowledge. We're going to want to pay a lot of attention to what our students already know. And this is an example. I want you to take a look at this picture. And figure out what it is. Hopefully you'll see that it's a picture of 3 cows, one on the left and 2 on the right, where one is standing somewhat behind the one that's in front. And this came from a teacher in Iowa who had a second grade class. And his second graders, who were rather more literal and less experienced in the world than we are, said there were 2 cows, one of which had 7 legs. And then the teacher asked the children to explain this picture. And they had some very interesting responses. One said the cow on the left is a real cow. The one on the right is a costume with an extra person in it. Another said the cow on the left is a real cow. The one on the right is twins, like conjoined twins. One said the cow on the right has a birth defect. And one said the cow on the left is an American cow. I guess the one on the right is from another country. So it seems obvious to us because of the prior knowledge we have and of the world and what it looks and how things work. But of course, not everybody has that same experience. And so think about what the prior knowledge, the prior experiences were of those students in that second grade class when they looked at this picture. We all see the same thing, but we explain it in a lot of different ways. So it turns out that what your student already knows about a topic has an enormous impact on learning. But for example, if I were to read a book about baseball, I wouldn't learn nearly as much as my nephew, who knows a ton about the subject already. So really what that tells us is that we want, when we're learning something, our brain, of course, is looking for that neural network to hook it into. If we can't find one, it's going to make it very, very difficult for it to have any meaning for us. So if we focus on that and help your student find that neural network, that prior knowledge, it will greatly enhance learning. So you can have them explain what they already know about something. You can help them fill in the gaps. If it's a very new subject and they don't have a strong network to connect the information to, then creating an experience with them may be really important in order to support that learning, because we don't learn things sort of in a vacuum. So for example, if you had to, you were studying animals and there were some kinds of animals that your child didn't have experience with, then going to the zoo to see them, unless they're hanging out in your backyard, but there are undoubtedly some kinds of animals that aren't hanging out in your backyard. Or something like making orange juice from concentrate, where if you're studying ratios, where you have to have 3 cans of water to 1 can of concentrate, or whatever that ratio actually is. All right, so number 9, counting down again, is having a clear rationale for something, for what they're learning. The orange juice experience, if we want to go back to that for a second, gives students direct experience with ratios, but it also helps because it supports this this one on our top 10 list, making sure that there's a clear rationale. Obviously, making a picture of orange juice is a clear rationale for something, and understanding those ratios. But it just want to underscore how important it is that we help them understand what the rationale is. The purpose of our brain, the reason that we have brains that do everything we do, is for survival. So everything, all the ways that our brains function are developed over a long periods of time in order to help with survival. And so if we are dealing with things like punctuation or fractions or scientific method or other kinds of things, if we can't explain to our students how important these are, or how these are relevant in their everyday lives, we're going to, it's going to make it much harder for them to learn about them. If it's not a matter of survival, it's very hard to get the brain to pay attention, much less retain whatever it is they're being exposed to. Of course, we can always explain to our students that they need to learn something because it will help them later or help them get into college or get a good job. Those are about survival. But if you can find something more immediate and show them how they can use that skill in everyday life, it will take on more priority, have deeper meaning, and make it easier to learn. I do want to say here that sometimes understanding the rationale of what is in things like Common Core standards is puzzling for all of us. I will say that there are many highly trained teachers who often struggle with figuring out what the rationale is for some things, or just sort of slide over it because they themselves aren't sure how to convey to students why it's critical that they learn these things. But if we can do that, we're going to have a much easier time. So our brains are constantly surveying the landscape, looking at what's going on, figuring out what the most important thing is at any given moment. And so if we can make that learning objective personal, if we can make it clear why the learning should be prioritized, then it can be very, very helpful. So what I did is I tried to think of ways to help students recognize the rationale for the three things that I listed on the previous slides as a survival need to at least a highly relevant topic. So here's my take on the survival value of punctuation. So when students are learning about commas, I would consider having them explain how these two sentences differ. Let's eat, Grandma, or let's eat Grandma. Well, this is sort of an extreme and it's sort of funny. You can ask your students to think about the kinds of misunderstandings that could arise, like this one, when a writer can't communicate to a reader, and how important punctuation is to the reader's understanding. Another way to do this, another way to make it sort of immediately relevant is to create games around things like this. Games can be very motivating because you're trying to achieve a very short-term objective. So, well, it's not quite the same in terms of being inherently a survival thing. The brain does respond in a little bit the same way. And so, for example, there's a program that is offered through the Homeschool Buyers Co-op called Literacy Planet, which covers punctuation and lots of other aspects of literacy in a very gamified context. And so you can get students to practice those kinds of things. And there's a reward for becoming proficient. And that, of course, creates that immediate relevance. Again, this is a little bit ridiculous, but it's the kind of scenario that you can use. Sometimes doing something that's a little crazy and off the wall does motivate attention and get kids involved in something. So I tried to think of an example of the survival value of fractions. And so I made up this scenario where you have a terrible disease and you have to get there's a medicine that will save your life, but you have to have pretty much the exact amount of it, because if you don't, it either won't help at all or your hair will all fall out. So, or you could make up, something else. And you have a limited selection of measuring spoons. Again, this is the kind of thing that you could take with sugar or flour or whatever you have in your kitchen and teaspoons of different sizes, and you could play around with this and say, okay, let's imagine that we needed this safe, effective dose of our medicine. Could we figure out how to create this? So we're getting them involved in that, giving them a real rationale or a purpose or a goal for the near term. And the third example was the scientific method. This one is a natural for rationale because it's all about whatever you do about the scientific method can be answering questions that are highly relevant to your students. Make sure that your student owns the question, that it's real for them. I made up another silly one too, but we could come up with a hypothesis about what would happen to students who rub this green goo on their feet before a big test, or whatever. And there are tons of ideas for experiments or for things that you can work around the scientific method, but you can also just look around your community, your friends, your relatives to find things that pique their interest. When it's authentic, when it's something that's real, it's really relevant, we can get them. And in fact, you can get your students to become their very own mythbusters by testing things that they're curious about. Number 8 on our countdown list, multisensory learning. Humans are very visual, powerful visual and auditory learners. Evolution made certain that we could get information very, very efficiently in both ways, and that we could prioritize those things that are most important. So I want you now to do a little thought experiment. If you close your eyes and imagine the smell of freshly mown grass, what do you feel? What are you hearing? What are you sitting on? What's in your hand? So hopefully that sort of conveys how easy it is to think about, to recall maybe a particular situation you might have been. Not so long ago, teachers were told they had to pay a lot of attention to learning styles and that we had to prioritize learning styles for our students. And that has been completely debunked. It is the case that we all learn better when we use multiple senses to learn. So don't try to, we sometimes will say that I'm more of an auditory learner, more of a visual learner. But the fact of the matter is that we really rely on both, and the integration of all that information to have something be truly meaningful and truly memorable, which is, of course, what learning is. If we think about this in terms of those neural networks we talked about earlier, so we said that neurons group together into neural networks. The networks that are part of our sensory system, the auditory system, the visual system, each of these has its own neural networks and pathways to take in information, and then they combine in other parts of their brains that help integrate that. So the more pathways we have, that is, the more senses we use, the greater chances we have that something will trigger the information that we learned. So it's just a very practical reason. Here's some examples of multisensory learning. When you annotate while you're reading, creating a cognitive map or a mind map. We'll come back and I'll have an example of that in a little bit. Using smell as a memory cue. Smell, that's why I use the example of the freshly mown grass, can be a very strong memory cue, or colors. Creating pictures, images, diagrams. Listening while reading the same text can be very also reinforced through multiple senses, the information we're taking in, taking notes, or visualizing when we're listening. Number 7 on our countdown list, use emotions. 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 Okay, another thought experiment. What I'd like you to do is think back to a time when you were about 7 years old, maybe second grade or around that time, and think of something that happened that year when you were about 7. Okay, so if everybody has something in mind, my guess is that that event was either very happy or very sad. It had emotion attached to it. When we attach emotions to memory, they are much, much stronger. Emotions can be a bit of a two-edged sword. We have to recognize that. And we probably don't need neuroscience to tell us this, but emotions are extremely important in the learning process. They can help or they can hinder learning. So if a learning situation is stressful, as it might be when you're taking a high stakes test or something like that, that can trigger that fight or flight response, that stress response. When we are fearful, cognition basically can shut down. Our ability to think coolly and rationally just simply goes away. Emotion always overrides cognition. So learning situations have to be physically and psychologically safe. I would guess that in a learning situation in a homeschool environment is most likely quite a bit less stressful than it might be in school. And that is certainly one of the advantages, many advantages of homeschooling. But something to keep in mind nonetheless, particularly if your students get to the point where they are taking a high stakes test or something like that. On the other hand, the other side of the coin, or the other side of that two-edged sword, is that emotions are absolutely necessary for learning. So the negative aspects of emotion have gotten a lot of attention, but just because we want to minimize negative emotions doesn't mean we want to avoid emotions altogether. Just like that emotional memory that you recalled, emotion can help other things be more memorable. So if we can get that a very positive emotion associated with something, if we and when we talked about relevance, giving students a real reason to be motivated to learn something, that's going to help them pay attention. It's probably going to raise the level of adrenaline just a little bit. Adrenaline is not just a stress response. It's actually one of those neurochemicals that puts an extra stamp on learning so that it's easier to remember later. So if we get that emotional and motivational interest and engagement, we're actually going to get stronger memories. So here's an example of a way you can do that. You can think of hopefully many, many other ways, but this is an example from a lesson on the period called Reconstruction that followed the Civil War in the United States. And you can read about it in a textbook, or we might decide instead to look at some pictures from that time. Most students may not really give a lot of meaning to the term Reconstruction, or may not be able to explain why it was called Reconstruction. But if we think about this, if we hear some pictures, visual prompts that might be used in this context, if we look at these pictures and consider what had to be reconstructed, here's certainly an example. And you can ask your students, what do you think these buildings were? Were these people's homes? The town hall? The church? What's it like when all those things need to be reconstructed? What does this picture suggest about Reconstruction? In this one, imagine the terror of being in a burning city. Do you think there were things other than buildings that needed to be reconstructed? Okay, down to number 6, using patterns. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We're always looking for patterns. We're always trying to connect what we're exposed to, what we're learning about, into an existing set of networks. And the ability to recognize a pattern saves us huge amounts of time and energy in learning something new. So not only are we connecting it, which we know is going to strengthen and give us more access to that information, but when we can create a pattern or see a pattern in something, it's actually going to help make the process of learning easier, as well as more effective. So here's an example of a type of pattern that can be very, very useful. Categorizing information actually makes things easier to remember. So think about your grocery list, for example. If you group your things on your grocery list by department or aisle, so dairy, meat, produce, etc., just doing that will make it less likely that you'll forget something. This particular diagram, which is about the writing process, and you can see it has categories like pre-writing, revision, proofreading, and publishing. It has all of those other ideas categorized. This is also referred to as a cognitive map or a mind map, which shows the relationship. So this is sort of a double a twofer here where you're getting both the categorization as well as the visual representation of the relationships among things and how we can connect them in our minds, which is very helpful. When you're doing a mind map like this, the really important thing is that the student create it. Your mind map will be great for your mind, but remember that we all build our own understanding of something and has to connect to our own neural networks. So having the student do it is really important. Or consider this pattern. When you're reading a textbook, you can almost always count on the main idea being the first sentence of a paragraph. Then come the significant details. Helping students see this pattern will help with learning efficiency and effectiveness, where they immediately know where to look. It becomes routine, it becomes automatic. And it also then provides them the structure of a very useful pattern to use in their own writing, of course. But knowing this is why when you start, for example, maybe to read a research journal, which has a very different structure to it than the kind of pattern we're used to in textbooks, that can be a learning curve. But when we understand and we can anticipate and reliably get the kind of pattern we're expecting, that will help make things more efficient. So here are some of the kinds of patterns you can be on the lookout for. Seeing these relationships helps multiple pieces of information become a chunk. So in a category, we take a bunch of things and they become part of that category or a chunk of information. You may have heard the concept of chunking, which makes things easier to remember. And it's really creating a set of relationships in a neural network so that information can be retrieved and considered as a chunk. So categories, similarities and differences, cause and effect, all of these are different kinds of patterns to be alert for in learning. And if we can start to identify them, it really gives our brains a huge advantage in understanding and dealing and retrieving them. Number 5, exercise and movement. Exercise is actually one of the most important things any of us can do, kids and parents, to improve learning. Regular exercise actually helps the brain grow. It actually helps when we're creating, we do have a few new neurons that are born from time to time, and exercise is important in recruiting those into neural networks. And if we exercise before we learn something challenging, it can make a real difference in the readiness to learn of our brains. Particularly stimulating the frontal lobe part of our brain that you can see, the orange colored part of the brain, the frontal lobe, which is where we manage focus, concentration, organization, and planning. So obviously things that we really want to have operating at their peak when we're in a learning situation. So don't forget that exercise. And it turns out that you can even combine these things. Moving while learning also improves learning. So if you have more than one student at home, you could consider a walking discussion group. You can see here the balance balls. I've personally never tried the stationary bike at a desk. That seems a little much to me, but apparently all of these kinds of things actually do improve learning. If you are working with a single child at home, you could go on a walk with them and get yourself a little exercise. I find that if I'm stuck on something in my work, getting myself up and moving around, sometimes I take a walk and talk to myself. I try not to do it out loud too much because people might think it's a little strange, but when I do that, I find that I often get unstuck. And so don't forget that exercise and movement. Number 4, distributed practice. So those initial learning situations, which is a lot of what we've been talking about up to now, are really important. But remember that these neural networks that we're creating, these memories that are bunches of neurons connected at synapses, those connections become even stronger when we reactivate them repeatedly over and over time, over and over time. Practice doesn't necessarily make perfect, but it does make permanent. So we can strengthen learning through revisiting it. In fact, we have to for the skill or the knowledge to stick around and really become something that's easy for us to retrieve. Our brains are use it or lose it. Unless it is a highly emotional memory, we're going to have to practice it. And there's some very interesting work that suggests that there are patterns that are helpful for this. And it's sometimes referred to as spaced practice, also referred to as distributed practice. And that is, the idea is pretty basic. You have your first learning experience, that's that number 1 on this little chart. And then a period of time elapses, and then you reactivate that learning, and then another period of time follows. No one knows the exact pattern that's best, and it may vary, but in general, fairly frequent practice, or what's called massed practice at the beginning, soon after something is learned, is valuable. And then you can extend the periods of time between practice, and that seems to create the best outcomes in general. So at first you might repeat the practice daily, then every few days, and when it becomes well learned, you can extend that period of time, and it should be there when it comes time for the test, or when you want to revisit it and be around for a much longer period of time. Number 3, sleep. I don't know if we always think about sleep as a learning enhancer, but it is huge, which is why it's pretty high on my countdown list. Here's what the research says about sleep. If you have been awake for 19 hours straight or longer, your brain functions as if you were over the legal limit for drinking. Your reflexes and your decision-making and your ability to problem solve, like in a test, are significantly impaired. The other thing we need to know, so that's an immediate impact on attention and cognitive performance, but it's also really vital because sleep is when memory gets encoded. If memory doesn't get encoded, it disappears. It also helps solidify memory against new learning. So sometimes when we learn something and we learn another thing that's new, that can interfere with the learning of that first thing. But when in sleep, we actually create protection against that. There's also fascinating research that people solve problems after they have slept that they couldn't solve before. So they compared people who had slept to those who just waited over that same period of time. So when somebody says, let me sleep on it, there's a very valid reason for that. Adults need 7 to 8 hours of sleep each night. There's a few people who thrive on 4 hours, but those are rare exceptions. And you may be familiar with this concept of stages of sleep, but the reason I want to explain this is that if you look at this graph here with the up and the down, so W is for waking, 4 is for deep sleep, and that stage 1 level where those little boxes are what is called REM sleep, rapid eye movement. It is during REM sleep that most of the memory encoding process takes place. So if you look on this chart and you look at 12 and you go to, say you went to bed at midnight, and if you wake up after 4 hours, you're going to have been through 2 REM cycles. If you go another couple of hours, you can see that you've bought yourself another REM cycle. And if you go through a full 8, then you've gotten 5 REM cycles in and given yourself a much better chance of encoding that memory than you would otherwise have had before. So sleep is a huge learning enhancer. Number 2, we're really getting there. In your own words. So I'd like you to think for a moment about how you or your student would typically approach reading a book, a textbook or other kind of book? Do you underline or highlight? Do you go back and then reread the material before the test? It turns out that that approach, highlighting and rereading, are very inefficient because we're having to do it all over again a second time. So what can we do to avoid having to redo all that work? And the answer is we need to do things like annotating while we read, summarizing, and then teaching. So researchers have investigated a lot of different strategies. And in one study, they looked at 10 different learning strategies. And one consistent finding was that anything that required learners to put things into their own words resulted in better learning. So it may seem like more work initially. Oh, this is actually number 2. Just ignore that number 1. We still got number 1 to come. Number 2, in your own words. It may seem like more work initially, and it is. Learning requires work. You're changing physically. Remember, we're talking about creating and strengthening neural networks in the brain, connecting into, making new connections that didn't exist before. That takes energy. When we're physically changing brain structures, that takes energy. But then the remembering is much easier. So ultimately, it makes learning more efficient and effective. So really try to engage these kinds of strategies as much as possible where your student is expressing it in any way in their own words and in their own, making a mind map and things like that also are ways of putting things into our own words. And the top of our top 10 list is building learning capacity. So far we've focused on making learning more effective and efficient by using strategies that appeal to how the brain naturally learns. But the ability to learn efficiently is also something that can be developed. So the first things were sort of how we can create the outside environment that is going to be the most conducive. This is really, now we want to take just a quick look at how we create that internal environment, those cognitive processes. So our brains are not like a glass of water that, as we said, that we can pour only so much information into, or a pipe that can only handle a certain speed of flow. The brain's capacity to learn is flexible. And when it comes to education, we typically focus on the level that's like the second level down here in this chart. We focus on reading, we focus on math and science, we focus on social emotional learning. And we sometimes forget that there's this whole underlying infrastructure, if you will. There are all these ways that information gets into our brains and is stored and retrieved, and where we learn and make sense of it and make all those connections. So the learning process actually starts, we talked before about information coming in through our senses, and largely that's what these processes down in this bottom box are. There are things like attention and visual processing and auditory processing, whether we can keep things in a sequential order as they're coming in, or whether we can see a mass of information and get the big picture. So all of these kinds of things at the bottom are basic ways that information gets into our brains from the outside world to start that learning process. That second level where you see it says core executive functions, those are the directive capacities of our brains, if you will. There are 3 core executive functions, and these are highly predictive. How well our brains do these processes are highly predictive of everything above that tier on this chart, all the way up to the very top one. And there are 3 core executive functions. One is working memory, which is how you hold information in your mind to think about it or manipulate it. Another is inhibitory control, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's your ability to not do something that you otherwise would do. And then cognitive flexibility is how your mind shifts between different types of tasks or in the ability to approach a problem from a different point of view or something like that. So these may seem like things that happen in addition to reading and writing and math and all of that. But as this chart implies, these are actually really important in the processes of learning to read and reading, the process of learning math and doing math. So for example, if we take working memory, that's the ability to hold information in our mind while we think about it. If you think about what's happening when you're reading, you have a text, you're taking in pieces of information, you're holding them in your mind. While you think about them, you try to relate them to what you already know. That all happens in working memory. That's our only conscious processing. Inhibitory control. Keeping the obvious is the sort of impulsivity that we see in many children, or the opposite of is inhibitory control. But it turns out that even something like when you're reading, they've determined that when children will blurt out something, they'll take the first letter and then they'll just blurt something out that doesn't make any sense. It turns out that that is more related to inhibitory control than it is to guessing. So these are very, they're not visible necessarily when we're doing these, when we're reading or we're doing these other things, but they're absolutely essential. And then cognitive flexibility is the same kind of thing, really important when we're problem solving. If our first approach doesn't work, we need to really shift our mindset and think about things in a different way. Being able to do that is critical. So I wanted to share all of this simply because these are so important and so much a part of having that underlying capacity to learn. As some of you are likely already aware, these skills can be strengthened. And it can be a lot of fun as well as very challenging. So on this next slide, what I have is an area that talks about Brainware Safari, the cognitive training program that develops all of those skills on that pyramid. So there's a link here if you want to follow that and go learn some more about that. If you follow the recommended usage of the program, which is 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes for about 12 weeks, you should start to see some really dramatic changes in these skills. You will notice them in maybe potentially a variety of ways. If you do any cognitive testing, you will certainly see them there. But they start to appear in academics as well. And we see some really impactful changes in reading and math as well as other subject areas. It's really, we have one brain and we bring it to every learning experience that we have. And so whether it's reading or math or science or something else, having this strong infrastructure for problem solving, for thinking, for focus, for concentration, all of those kinds of things are going to pay off in just so many ways. So I think we're now at the point where I would love to see if there are some questions, and I'd be delighted to take on any that anybody has.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Betsy. I would like to remind everybody that you can type your questions directly in the chat box. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. So what is the ideal age to start implementing these practices for a student?
Well, we've got 10 of them, and I would say, I meant to create a single list of them, but many of these you can use from very, very early. When you think about, if you think about prior knowledge, you're calling on that information when your toddler is looking at, let's say you've gone for a walk and there's a squirrel sitting, or there's a squirrel sitting on the park bench. And if you, you talk about what that animal is, and then maybe you compare it to other animals or other things, do you think that squirrel's bigger than your teddy bear? You're whenever you're encountering something, or if you, I have a funny story about when I was a little girl and I went to somewhere with my parents to the home of some friends, and we walked in the door and their dog came to the door with them to greet us. And I went, "Oh, look, Mommy, there's a cow." Well, in my experience, I guess at that point in my life, I had never seen a cow before. And so it was a big four-legged animal. And I just guessed that it was a cow. So you can, whenever you are helping your child understand how something compares to something they already know about, many parents do this just sort of automatically. Okay, remember when we did this? This is sort of like that. Activating that prior information and helping them connect it is really, can be very helpful. So I would say most of these are things that are just inherent in the way, if I think about clear rationale, because I said so is not nearly as good a reason as, well, tomorrow we're going to go do X and you're going to need to know how to do this in order to have the most fun doing whatever it is we're going to be doing, or, whatever it is. So these are just truths, hopefully, about the way that our brains learn anything from very early ages.
And is there a certain point where we're too old to change our approach if these practices haven't been used previously?
Absolutely not. We are never too old. The most wonderful thing that we know today about all of these changes and how the brain changes itself, the term that the neuroscientists use is neuroplasticity. And yes, our brains are plastic. They're not made of plastic, but they're plastic in the sense that they change. Our brains are constantly changing. Every experience we have, in fact, everybody who is participating in this webinar today, when you're finished, your brain is going to be different from what it was before. Every experience we have physically changes the brain. Think about that power. Think about that awesome, amazing experience we have to be able to actually help our children sculpt their brains, to build their brains. And everything we do is doing that. So throughout life, from the moment we're born until the day we die, our brains can change. And so it's especially important, I think, for older adults. Some of us have established probably some I won't say bad, that's probably not a good term, but less effective practices. If we've been highlighting, I think of people that I knew who, would highlight essentially every line in a book. Well, they're going to have to go back and reread all that. That's not efficient. That's not a good way to learn. And so there's no reason we can't learn to do things differently as adults.
So we have questions from some of our attendees. Mm-hmm. We are currently working on inhibiting retained infantile reflexes. Would it be best for us to complete that program before beginning work at the cognitive level?
So that's a question you want to probably discuss with your therapist, whoever's working on that. I'm not an expert in that area. I would, so I don't really know. I'm sorry, I just can't. I don't want to give you wrong information and not have you, so I guess whoever's working with you on that particular goal, I would ask them about that.
Awesome, thank you. And then what is the recommended usage of Brainware Safari?
So for Brainware, it's 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 45 minutes. You could do it up to an hour, but your brain's going to get tired after that. And so more is not always better. And then if you do it consistently for a period of 12 weeks, if you have to take a vacation or whatever, or you miss a few days, you're not going to worry about that. You're just going to want to make sure you get that time in. So if it takes you 14 weeks or something like that, that's fine. But don't do it once a week. If you do it once a week, it's like going to the gym once a week. You might feel a little less guilty, but it's not going to do anything for your strength or your flexibility or your cardiovascular health. If we're going to really change the brain, we want to do it with the frequency and intensity. And that's what our research says. If you do it that way 3 to 5 times a week, you're going to get some significant cognitive gains.
Thank you so much. And we're just about out of time. So I would just like to, first of all, say thank you so much, Betsy. This was absolutely fascinating, as always. I personally love when Betsy gives webinars for us. I'm just so intrigued by everything she has to say.
Well, I do too. I really enjoyed it. And this one was very fun to think of all of the things that I know and to pick my top 10 very favorites. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, it was wonderful. And then for all of our attendees, if you are interested in getting Brainware Safari, please visit this link that Betsy has up, which is homeschoolbuyerscoop.org/brainware-safari-download. And at the co-op, you can save 34% on that. And then also, earlier in the presentation, she mentioned Literacy Planet. I put that link in the chat box, but for reference, it is, again, homeschoolbuyerscoop.org/literacy-planet, and you can save 22% on that. So I will also be sending an email to everybody with this recording, a link to all of Betsy's slides, and links to both of those offers in the next day or two. So keep your eye out for that. So again, thank you, Betsy. And thank you so much to everybody who attended today. It's great to, see our community out here. Good luck getting set up for the new school year, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thanks so much.
Bye.